an independent analysis of European defense capabilities and strategic policy.
The recent strategic realignment within the Swedish defense establishment signals a fundamental shift in the operational logic of Nordic security. It is moving beyond the initial administrative integration into the Atlantic Alliance toward a more profound assimilation into its nuclear deterrence architecture. This transition is not merely a diplomatic evolution. It appears to be a systemic response to the widening gap between the stated security guarantees of the United States and the material reality of its force posture in Northern Europe. As Washington recalibrates its global resources toward the Indo-Pacific, indicated by the resource allocation priorities in the January 2026 National Defense Strategy, the defense apparatus in Stockholm confronts a critical capability vacuum. The reliance on the Defense Cooperation Agreement, which grants access to 17 military facilities across Sweden, provides a legal framework for reinforcement, but it does not inherently guarantee the physical presence of American conventional assets sufficient to deter a high-intensity regional aggression without immediate nuclear escalation. This capability gap necessitates a re-evaluation of the European pillar of deterrence. It forces Swedish planners to consider the nuclear arsenals of France and the United Kingdom not as auxiliary options, but as essential components of national survival. However, a technical and quantitative analysis of these alternatives reveals significant structural limitations. The combined stockpile of approximately 500 warheads possessed by London and Paris represents less than 10% of the estimated Russian inventory. This creates a disparity that challenges the credibility of a counterforce strategy. Furthermore, the operational sovereignty of these deterrents varies significantly. The British deterrent relies heavily on American technology through the Trident system. This implies that its independent usage is technically and perhaps politically constrained by Washington. Conversely, the French doctrine remains strictly autonomous. It is bound by the nebulous definition of vital interests, which may, or may not, extend to the territorial integrity of the Baltic states or the Swedish mainland in a crisis that falls short of an existential threat to France itself. From an industrial and technological perspective, this strategic dilemma redefines the operational requirements for the Swedish Air Force and the ongoing development of the Gripen E program. If Sweden fully integrates into the NATO nuclear sharing mechanisms, specifically the support of nuclear operations with conventional air tactics, or SNOCAD, the role of domestic combat aircraft undergoes a significant transformation. The Gripen E would likely not be tasked with the delivery of gravity bombs, a role reserved for dual-capable aircraft like the F-35A. Instead, it would assume the critical function of electronic warfare escort and suppression of enemy air defenses. The advanced electronic warfare suite integrated into the Gripen E suggests that the platform is technically optimized for this high-threat environment. It potentially acts as a non-kinetic force multiplier, allowing allied nuclear-armed platforms to penetrate dense anti-access and area denial bubbles. This operational integration validates the heavy investment in indigenous electronic warfare capabilities. It frames them not just as tools for territorial defense, but as niche assets within the broader alliance strike complex. The integration of Sweden into this nuclear support architecture also implies a fundamental restructuring of national infrastructure and logistics. The strategic value of locations such as Gotland and the naval bases in Karlskrona shifts. from being defensive bastions intended to delay an invasion to becoming forward operating nodes for alliance power projection. In a nuclear support scenario, Swedish airspace and air bases become critical staging grounds for tanker support, command and control relay, and recovery of strike aircraft. This operational reality elevates the priority of hardening infrastructure against preemptive strikes. It suggests that the current budget allocation of 2.6% of GDP may need to be redirected toward ballistic missile defense and passive survivability measures, rather than solely focusing on maneuver units. The recent acquisition of satellite capabilities through the cooperation with ICEYE further reinforces this trend, as persistent surveillance becomes a prerequisite for the timely decision-making required in a nuclear crisis. Such a shift introduces a complex trade-off between the concept of total defense, which relies on broad societal resilience and mobilization, and the requirements of high-end deterrence, which demands centralized, rapid, and often secretive command structures. The historical Swedish doctrine of armed neutrality was predicated on the ability to raise the cost of invasion sufficiently to deter aggression. The new paradigm relies on the threat of catastrophic retaliation delivered by allies. This transition effectively removes the option of de-escalation or opting out of a conflict once Article 5 is invoked. Swedish assets would be inextricably linked to the kill chain of the alliance's most strategic weapons. Consequently, the distinct line between conventional conflict and nuclear escalation blurs within the Baltic theater. Dual capable systems and support infrastructure become valid targets for an adversary seeking to blind or decapitate the alliance's northern flank. Furthermore, the industrial base faces a potential divergence between export ambitions and alliance obligations. As Swedish defense technology becomes more deeply integrated into the sensitive nuclear support structures of NATO, export controls and technology transfer restrictions may tighten. This limits the ability of companies like Saab to market their most advanced systems to non-aligned nations. The integration of US or UK-sourced cryptographic and communication modules required for nuclear command and control interoperability could create black boxes within Swedish platforms. This reduces the level of technological sovereignty that has been a hallmark of the national defense industry strategy for decades. It suggests a future where industrial viability is increasingly dependent on the internal NATO market and the supply chains of major powers, rather than on the independent global marketplace. Ultimately, the trajectory of Swedish defense policy points toward a deeper structural dependency on the nuclear decision-making processes of London and Paris. This is driven by the uncertainty of American commitment. This alignment strengthens the collective deterrence of the Nordic region, but simultaneously binds Sweden to the strategic calculations of external powers in a manner unprecedented in its modern history. The resulting security architecture is arguably more robust against conventional coercion, but it appears significantly more brittle in the face of crisis escalation, where the automaticity of alliance mechanisms may override local political control. The operationalization of this nuclear support role transforms Sweden from a buffer state into a frontline integrator, where the stability of the entire system rests on the assumption that the technological and doctrinal interoperability between the Swedish Armed Forces and the European nuclear powers is sufficiently credible to mask the quantitative disparities in the strategic balance of power.